I'm Jim Lyttle, and I'm going to talk about humor. This is going to take a few minutes, so please pull up a chair. First, let's look at the simplest case of humor. Somebody makes a wisecrack and you laugh. You might giggle or titter or smirk, and if it was a pun, you might groan or roll your eyes. If you were at a funeral, you might just smile indulgently. But no matter what, you're behaving in response to something that you found funny. That something came from outside of you, and your behavior is aimed outside of you. But something important is missing in this chart. You. Humor depends on an observer. Nothing is funny until someone finds it funny. Even the biggest and most successful comedians would never go on stage with new material if it had not been tested on some humans. And humans, of course, are the problem. People have traits or habitual ways of being in the world. Some are outgoing, some are shy. Some are optimistic, some are skeptical. Some are nice, some are calculating. Each person is different, and good comics know their audiences well. People also have moods. If their dog died this morning, they may not be in any mood for jokes. If it's been a boring or challenging day, such as nurses have all the time, they may be primed to laugh at the slightest thing. Within the context of all these traits and states or moods, people will conduct the cognitive process of deciding whether something's funny. First, they'll try to understand the sentence they just heard or the image they saw and notice whether it's unusual. This is the basis of several incongruity theories of humor. It's a very old insight that humor involves putting together things that do not seem to belong together. Aristotle wrote the Rhetoric in the middle of the 4th century BC. Book 3 is about style, and part 11 addresses metaphor. Here he gives an example of humor from some contemporary comedy. Onward he came, and his feet were shod with his chilblains. Now these are blisters or sores on the feet. And Aristotle even signified the pause before the punchline, but he didn't seem to think of incongruity per se as a source of the humor. 400 years later, in 55 BC, Cicero wrote On the Orator for his brother. In chapter 63 of book 2, he explains in passing, you know already, however, that the most familiar of these is exemplified when we are expecting to hear a particular phrase and something different is uttered. Again, he did not notice or highlight the importance of incongruity in defining what things might be found funny. Thus, incongruity theory is often attributed to the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant, who described it in his 1790 work on aesthetics called Critique of Judgment. However, it was really the Scottish poet James Beattie who first addressed the concept head-on. In a chapter that he wrote in 1764, he writes on page 347, may we not then conclude that laughter arises from the view of two or more inconsistent, unsuitable, or incongruous parts or circumstances, considered as united in one complex object or assemblage, or as acquiring a sort of mutual relation from the peculiar manner in which the mind takes notice of them. If a thing does not seem incongruous or out of the ordinary, people will simply take note of it and get on with their day. But if the thing is incongruous, it will have caught their attention. Now, for advertisers and for some other purposes, this is the main utility of humor, to attract attention. But there's another important step to consider. People will quickly make a judgment about whether the incongruous thing is safe. This is the basis of several superiority theories of humor. Humor was characterized by both Plato and Aristotle as ridicule, and Plato decreed in about 380 BC, as part of the Republic, that authority figures, and especially God, should never be depicted as being overcome with laughter. People were no doubt thinking about such things earlier than that, but Plato and Aristotle are some of the earliest authors from whom we have material to study. Superiority theory is rightly associated with the English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, although it's not his book Leviathan that's the real source for this idea. 11 years earlier, in chapter 9 of The Elements of Law, Natural and Politic, which was written in 1640, paragraph 13 states that there is a passion which hath no name, but the sign of it is that distortion of the countenance we call laughter. After giving some examples, he declares famously, "I may therefore conclude that the passion of laughter is nothing else but a sudden glory arising from sudden conception of some eminency in ourselves by comparison with the infirmity of others, or with our own formerly." This version of superiority theory seems too strong, of course, but it is true that we do not laugh at things that are currently scaring us. We cannot enjoy tasteless dead baby jokes when our own child is sick, for example. Think of the sound of broken glass. If you're in a bar and hear that sound, you know that someone dropped a tray and you might respond with cheers and applause. But if you're alone in a dark alley and that same sound occurs, it'll generate a very different feeling. If a thing does not seem safe, people will consider it frightening and they'll avoid it, or they'll try not to think about it at all. However, if the incongruous thing is fairly safe, we'll feel free to enjoy it, and this is what we call mirth. So we now have a complete chain of events, from a spontaneous wisecrack to laughter in response to it. And this would allow us to come up with the simplest possible definition of humor, which would be humor means enjoying incongruity. In fact, a modern author named Peter McGraw uses this definition rebranded as the benign violation theory of humor. Of course, humor is not always spontaneous. Much humor is carefully crafted to elicit our laughter. Behind every talk show host is a team of at least a dozen writers, too often male, who are taking the day's news stories and applying standard comedy techniques such as exaggeration, reference to pop culture figures. Some humor, on the other hand, is really accidental, no human intervention at all. Unlike the carefully crafted comedy of a monologue or a well-rehearsed summer movie, accidental humor is intended by no one. Perhaps a stern headmaster reading a riot act to young students suddenly gets bonked on the head by a passing helium balloon. No one intended or even pointed out this humor, it just happened, and it was funny. Furthermore, there are many possible outcomes of humor besides laughter and smirking and groaning and so forth. For one thing, some humor really makes you think. Social commentary is often delivered wrapped up in humor, and some of Mark Twain's and Will Rogers' humor contains profound wisdom, even today. It's impossible to listen to Chris Rock's humor, in spite of all the vulgarity, without understanding some of his experience as a black man in New York City. Besides making you think, humor can also get you to like the humorist, whether it's a first date or a television advertisement. When you laugh with someone, you find that you have something in common, maybe a shared context or a similar sense of the absurd. And also, since laughing looks almost as unattractive as sexual ecstasy, there's a sense that you must be quite close to anyone with whom you're sharing such an experience. We discussed the incongruity theories and superiority theories, but there's one more category. These are the relief or release theories. They argue that we laugh because some taboo topic which we've been faithfully repressing all along is suddenly allowed to explode out of us in laughter. The pressure of holding in our sexist or bathroom or racist thoughts makes the explosion of laughter louder and stronger. This was English philosopher Herbert Spencer's idea from the Physiology of Laughter, which he published in March of 1860. And it was echoed by Sigmund Freud in his 1905 book, Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. It's not likely the sole explanation for humor or laughter, but dirty jokes are generally funnier than their cleaned up versions that we bring to church. So it would seem that the naughtiness magnifies the mirth and laughter. Now, Freud never understood why people found things funny that were just silly. One of my favorite absurd jokes is, her eyes were identical, especially the one on the left. The more you think about that, the less sense it makes. It's pure incongruity. And it took Marvin Minsky in 1984 to explain that such jokes were violations of logic rules just as surely as dirty jokes were violations of etiquette rules. Incongruity theorists are aware of this differentiation, and they separate pure incongruity, silly jokes that you might appreciate when you're, let's say, age 5, from another category they call incongruity/resolution, and they usually refer to as inc-res. Most jokes present the observer with an incongruous and absurd situation for a moment. The observer then figures it out by getting the joke. In some sense, the situation turns out to be not as crazy as it seemed at first, although it's rarely actually resolved. When teachers say they are paid weekly and laugh out loud, it takes a second to realize what they mean is that their pay is not strong or not sufficient. And this is a very simple example of incorrect humor. This kind of humor has the advantage of challenging us a little more cognitively, and it's usually a better way to deliver barely hidden social messages. So this is the aspect of humor that makes you think. On the other hand, when comics use too much vulgarity or too many dirty jokes, they seem desperate and lacking in sophistication, and this can generate a negative effect on liking for the source. Humor that offends people or attracts them from success at whatever they're doing will not endear you to them for long. So this is something to be avoided or at least used sparingly. In fact, any excessive use of humor can erode the sense of gravitas that's necessary for credibility in some jobs. Humor is not a low-risk panacea for organizational or interpersonal problems, but it does have clear benefits that we can celebrate. A sense of humor and a positive perspective on life reduces the harmful effects of stress. The physical act of laughing out loud feels good all over. Producing humor is akin to problem solving, using much of the same mental gymnastics. And recognizing humor both requires and indicates a strong familiarity with the way things are supposed to be, the patterns that are supposed to be there against which the humor is incongruous. So this pretty well exhausts what I know about humor. Do you folks have any ideas or suggestions?